Welcome everyone. So this video is going to go over how to go about doing your data analysis. So we're going to do a practice sort of run through of everything here using the pilot data sheet that you guys filled out on your own. And then what you'll be doing is you'll be going through the real data and kind of following along with what I'm doing here. So keep that in mind that what you're seeing me do is using a different set of data. So when you're doing this yourselves, everything will be very similar, but you'll be using a different data set. And I'm actually going to upload that data set file to the assignment so that you have access to it. So this first part that I'm going to go through here, you do not need to do. I'm just doing this to show you kind of how Qualtrics works and so that you can familiarize yourselves with sort of this process. But I will provide for you, I'll tell you when, I'm going to provide for you a file that kind of has already done these first parts of what I'm doing here. And then the rest of what we go through, you'll have to do on your own. So I hope that makes sense. But again, you can always reach out if you have questions that you'd like to talk with me about. Okay, so what you should be seeing here, we're going to switch over here. And what you're seeing here is the survey. So again, I'm doing this on the pilot sheet that you guys filled out. The real data set that you gave to participants looks very similar. It just has a couple of slight differences right here at the beginning. But you shouldn't really, that really shouldn't affect anything that you need to do. So I'm going to run through this stuff so that you can familiarize yourselves with how Qualtrics works a little bit better in this data analysis process, but then I'll tell you when you need to sort of start with the file that I've provided you. So as you may be familiar with already, this is what Qualtrics looks like, and you can see all of the scales and questions that were included in the survey that was given to, again, both you and participants. So you can see there's individual questions, of course, for each different thing, but a lot of these questions come together to give some score on a scale that you may be interested in analyzing. So for example, we have the big five here, and each of these clusters sort of refers to one of those big five personality traits. Actually, it's the first four questions, so it's not broken up perfectly. But for example, these first four questions are all a measure of extroversion. So what we're going to need to do is find some way to combine the scores on these four questions to get one measure of extroversion for each participant. And we'll talk about that in a second. Same thing if you look down here. This is our self-esteem score. All of these questions are related to a person's value of their own self-esteem, but we don't want to look at each question individually. Instead, what we want to look at is an overall score of their self-esteem. So we're going to end up combining each of whatever they chose for each of these questions into one overall score for self-esteem. Same thing with all of these scales. Now, this is going to be done in the data set that you get. Now, obviously, you may not be looking at each of these values, so we'll talk about how you select the ones you're interested in. But how this is done, how this combining process is done, is in Qualtrics, there's a bunch of different options over here. And on the left-hand side, far left-hand side, you can see we have an option here called Survey Options. And under Advanced, we have Scoring right here. And so if we go to this Scoring tab, the way this works is we can create categories. So each category is a single score that we want to create. So for example, you see I've created the categories for extroversion, agreeableness, each of those big five, as well as our self-esteem, altruism, social, personal, emotional intelligence score, and this spirituality and religiosity scale as well. So when each of these categories is selected, you can go through and find the questions that are associated with that category. So these four questions are associated with extroversion, and you can see that I've scored the values for what each answer choice that someone may give, how many points that should give towards their extroversion score. Some questions are reverse scored, which means that, for example, don't talk a lot. So if they don't talk a lot, they say they agree with that, we don't want that to be a high score towards extroversion because it's the opposite. So we want a low score of extroversion if they say they don't talk a lot, and reverse that. So hopefully that makes sense. How I know which questions are associated with each scale is by using those links to the surveys that I sent you in the announcement that I made. So when you go to those links, you'll see each of the questions, and it also tells you which ones are reverse scored. So as you can see, each time I select one of these categories, you can see the questions associated with that category are selected. Again, if I go down to self-esteem, you'll notice that my self-esteem scale, I've selected and put in the values for each of these responses. So that's how you go about combining the individual questions. And what will end up happening, you'll see here in a second, is when we download our data and look at it in, we're going to start off in Excel, you'll see a score of self-esteem that has added up all the points for each participant on whatever options they chose. So if they chose somewhat agree for feels comfortable with myself, they get 4 points, plus whatever they chose for each of these other questions. All right, hopefully that makes sense. Let's go ahead and we'll go back to the survey here and talk about how we would go about downloading the data. Now, again, you don't need to do this. I've provided this step for you as well. I will tell you when to sort of jump in and start following along with me. But to download the data from Qualtrics, you want to go up to Data and Analysis up here, and this is how you pull these files. Now we see individual questions are here, but what we really want is we want this export and import option. We want to go export data. And so if I click on this, a pop-up appears, and I can choose what type of file I want to download and some different options for these downloads. Now I like doing CSV because of the way it looks. So that's what I have provided to you. I've converted it, but this is the way I like to download my data here. I like to use numeric values. This basically, rather than having the answer choice written in somewhat agree, it'll provide us with a number 4, for example. I like doing this because numbers are what we end up using at the end of the day, and that allows us to not have to convert everything manually. And then I like to choose more options and just make sure none of these are checked. Sometimes SPSS will like to check off to include this as a zip file. I don't know why it does this, but we don't want to do it as a zip file. We don't need to do it as a zip file. So I just like to leave that unchecked. So again, numeric values, and I like the CSV format. So if you download that, what's going to end up happening is you will end up with a file that looks like this. So let's kind of walk through a couple things here and look at this data set. And from this point on, this is the file that I will have provided to you with one small change here. And we're going to move on to this next step as we go. But the first thing I want to do before we do that is I like to resave this from a CSV file to an Excel workbook file. And this is what I'm going to provide to you. This is the last thing I'll do here before you need to start following along. And I just resave that as an Excel file because that allows us to do some more things that we can't do in a CSV file. So if you're ever doing this on your own, I recommend highly that you change it to an Excel file so you don't lose any work or have some issues associated with CSV files. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pause here for 1 second. All right, so now at this point on, we're going to switch over, and now we're going to talk about how you can follow along. So this is the file that you're going to get and download from your assignment in Canvas, and you'll basically be at the point that I'm at. Now remember, the file you're going to be looking at will look different than mine because it's the real data set, but I'm going through the practice data set here that you guys filled out. So no, if you see differences, that's why. I want you working on the real data, but I'm going to walk through kind of the process using this example set of data. All right, let's switch back over here and we can see now what we have here. I've changed, just removed your names so that those aren't visible here anymore, but we're going to walk through kind of what Excel gives us and all this information and how to kind of interpret all of it. All right, so the first thing I want to point out here is that we have a lot of information that may seem confusing, but we're going to break it down step by step. The first 3 rows are actually all pieces that Qualtrics is giving to us based on some different information about the questions that we have. So for example, this first row is actually what we've labeled the question as. So for example, you see we have age here, gender, and then each of these big 5 questions. The second row is what was actually presented to participants. So they were asked to please enter their age, they were asked to select the gender, and so on. And then the third row is just sort of a function that we use to actually import this data. So we don't really need that third row. It's just something that gets kind of put in with this transfer into Excel. The next thing I want to point out is that you may be seeing sort of these weird hashtag or pound symbols for some of the information on your screen. If you see that, the only reason that's there is because it's compressed down into a smaller format. So there's not enough space to present all of the data for this piece of information. So if I were to just kind of expand out this section, now there's enough space and you can see all of the information gets provided. So that's why it's showing up. It's just because there's not enough space. All right. Next, let's look at some extra information here that we have and kind of how this plays out. So you'll notice these first few columns here are some information that aren't necessarily exactly what the participants responded with, but provide us some information from Qualtrics. For example, what the start and end date were, what the response type was, how far they got, so their progress on the survey, how long it took them, whether or not they finished, what date it was recorded, and some information about each particular participant. So you'll notice then that each row represents one individual or unique participant. And this is all the information about them and their responses on each of the questions as we go. All right, so what we're going to do, the first step that I always like to do, and actually we'll make this easy, and we're actually going to remove row 3 here just because I like to keep things nice and simple and clean and try and clean things up as we go along the way. So I'm going to do that by coming over to the number 3 here. And one quick thing about Excel, if you click on any of the numbers, or the row numbers on the left, it's going to highlight and select the entire row. Same thing if I were to click on any of the column letters at the top, it's going to highlight and select that entire row. So if I want to remove a particular row, for example, row 3, I can click on row 3 and then simply right click and delete this row. And that gets rid of the row and it's no longer there. If I wanted to keep that space, but I wanted to get rid of the information in it, if I select the row and hit the delete button, it deletes all the information in the row, but keeps that blank row there if I wanted to fill it with something else. But that's not what I want to do. I want to delete the entire row and remove it. All right, so that's one step down. It looks a little bit nicer, but we still have a lot more to kind of go to work on cleaning this up. Now, something that we don't have here, but that is very useful and very helpful to include whenever we're working with participants, is a participant number assigned to each individual participant. Notice we don't get that here, so we're going to add that in ourselves manually. Now, we don't have space to add it on the left, so we're going to make a new column. So to do that is very simple. You're just going to right click wherever you want that information to go, and I want mine all the way on the left. So I'm going to right click on the column A, and I'm going to choose Insert. And what that's going to do is insert a new blank column to the left of where I had my cursor selected. From here, I'm just going to choose one of the two now header rows and label this as my participant number. And from there, I'm going to find the first participant, which now is appearing on row 3, and I'm going to start numbering down this column. Now, I don't want to write out every single participant number and have to do that manually, especially on the real data set. You're going to have a lot more participants to work with. So what's really cool about Excel is I can create sort of a set number of these, and then Excel can fill out the rest for me. So I'm just going to start numbering 1, 2, 3. Then I'm going to highlight all 3 of those. You see that box around those. And then I'm going to double click this bottom right green square, and that's going to fill out the pattern that I've started all the way to the bottom of my data set. Let's look at that one more time and make sure that we're doing this correctly, because there are some mistakes you can make along the way. For example, if I try and have this row selected and then click and drag, that's how I want to make sure that I select my data. Sometimes people have one selected and they say, okay, let me select this column by dragging this little corner down. If I do that, that's going to apply whatever I have selected initially to everything I'm highlighting. And that's just going to make everything a 1. And that's not what we want. So whenever we're selecting data, make sure that you just select in the middle of the cell and click and drag. So that's one thing to be careful of. Again, then we can double click or we could click and drag and apply this pattern all the way down to the bottom. All right, now that we have our participant numbers in, we're going to end up kind of cleaning this set up and removing a lot of extra information that we don't need. However, we may want to go back and reference that information in the future, or we may have deleted something we didn't mean to delete, and we want to make sure that we can save this original data set with all of the information that we got from Qualtrics and not lose that with these next steps we're about to take. So to do this, I'm actually going to come down here and I'm just going to duplicate this sheet. So Excel works by having multiple sheets down here at the bottom, kind of like multiple pages. And so if I click the little plus button, now I have a whole new blank sheet, but I can go back to my original sheet here. And actually, rather than clicking that plus button, you could do it that way, but I'm just going to right click on this sheet that I have open, and I'm going to choose move or copy, and then just check this box to say create a copy, and then hit OK. And what happens is I now have 2 identical versions of this data sheet. So whichever one, we'll just remove this one because we don't need this one anymore. Whichever one you decide, it's up to you. I want you to pretend like it no longer exists and imagine that, it's just there as a reference, but you're never going to touch it again. So I'm going to use that as the one on the left. And now this new one on the right, I'm going to do all of my future edits and work into. All right. With that said, there's a few steps we need to take first to identify participants that we don't want to include in our data and we're instead going to remove from our data sheet. There's a few different reasons why we might want to do this, and we'll walk through each of those. Number one, the first way to find participants that you probably don't want to keep in your data is you want to look at either the progress column or the finish column to see whether or not they finished the survey in the first place. So if I look down this, you'll see these last 3, we have either a 0 saying they didn't finish, or progress saying they got 56 and 44% of the way through the survey. And since they didn't finish the survey, we don't really want to include them in our data set. So what we're going to do, we're going to highlight these participants, and again, right click and delete those. Again, this is why it's important to keep an original set where we don't touch anything if we needed to go back and look at that information for one reason or another. All right, let's go back to our working set here. So now we've removed anyone that didn't finish the survey. And you might have to look through and scroll down and have more to sort through than I do. So pause here if you need to along the way at each step. All right, so we've removed participants that didn't finish the survey. Next, we want to look and see, is there anybody that maybe was a preview response or just us testing out our survey? Most likely you won't have this because we didn't do this for this survey, but it's always good practice just to check this and make sure that that is not the case. And you can do this by looking at the response type, and you want all of these to be 0. If you see one that's not a 0, then most likely you're going to want to remove them because it's either going to say not anonymous or it might say preview or something like that. And that's just telling you that it most likely wasn't a real participant, but instead was a trial that we did on our own when we were testing out our survey. So we don't have any of that here to work with, so that is great, keeps things simple. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to look at our age column, and we just want to double check and make sure we didn't get anybody that was under the age of 18. This is just one rule that I always follow, and I just look to make sure we don't have any underage participants, and if we do, we'll remove those from our data. Now, I don't know what D means, so we're going to pretend like this is an example of someone who was under the age of 18. So you'll see we don't have anybody else that's under 18, So we're going to use this as our example. And if that's the case, let's pretend they were, say, 17 years old. We will select them and once again, right-click and delete that participant. Now, once you've gone through and removed all of these participants for these different reasons we've talked about, being underage, not being a real participant, or not finishing the survey, you might be wondering whether or not we need to change and update our participant numbers over here, because notice now we go 8, 9, and then we skip to 11 because we've removed participant 10. That's actually not the case. We don't want to touch these participant numbers. We want to make sure they stay exactly how they were before. The reason for this is because notice now participant 11 falls on row 12. If we go back to our original data set, participant 11 falls on row 13. So the only way we can link our original data set with our new edited data set is by this participant number. So this is sort of our roadmap home to our original data. So make sure you don't touch those participant numbers and you keep them how they were so that you can always reference back to that original set. All right, now that we've removed our participants and we have our participant numbers all set, the next thing we can do is start removing information that we no longer need. For example, most of this information we got from Qualtrics that we just used to identify participants to remove, we don't really need anymore. So what I like to do is select all of those columns, all of those variables, and just right-click and delete those. So now we're already starting to get a cleaner, simpler data set going on. The next thing I want to point out to you is you'll notice if we scroll over all the way to the end of our data set, all the way here at the end, you start seeing these scores. So SC score 0, score 1, score 2, score 3, all the way to score 8. And you'll notice each of these scores is one of those values that we calculated for our scales. So this is the total value of all of their responses on the spirituality and religiosity scale, for example, as are all of these for the different elements of the Big Five and our other scales that we have here as well. So what's nice about this is that these are really the total scales. These are mostly what we're going to want to be concerning ourselves with. All of the rest of this data are the individual questions on each of those scales. So please rate for the specific questions, disliking myself, knowing my strengths, and so on. But because each of these questions has already been aggregated or added together in these scores, we no longer really need those individual questions. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through and identify which questions have been already scored at the end of our survey and remove or delete those individual question responses, again, to clean things up. Age and gender are individual questions. They're not being scored because they're not being combined with anything else. So because of that, we don't need to remove these questions. We want to keep them because they're our original values. When we start looking at the Big Five, we start getting all of these scales, these individual questions for the Big Five. So I'm going to select all of these Big Five questions. We know those have already been added together at the end of our survey, so I can delete those. Next, we have self-esteem. We know all of these self-esteem questions have been added together at the end of our survey for self-esteem, so we can delete those as well. Same thing for our altruism scale. Same thing for our social, personal, emotional intelligence scale. And then same thing for our spirituality and religiosity scale. And what we end up with is our total sum scores at the end now being what we're concerned with for actually looking at and analyzing in our next steps. All right, one last thing we're going to do here before we basically take this data set that has now been cleaned up and move over into SPSS. Notice we still have two rows that are basically showing us our variable names. We just want to combine these down to be one row that gives us our variable name. Now, for the most part, this second row looks really useful to just keep these names for all of these variables. So we don't really need these score numbers. But for this these first three columns, it looks like the top row is the one that we want, right? So we don't really want all these words. We just want to know that this is measuring age and this is measuring gender. So we'll delete the ones we don't need. And then we can simply just grab the row that we want and move it to where we want it. So that's all in one row here together. And then we can just delete that second row. So what we end up with is a nice single row with all of our variable names, followed by the values on each of those variables. Now from this point, this is up to you. You can choose to remove the variables you are not looking at in your study. And actually, I recommend you do this. So everyone should be including age and gender. But you may say, well, I'm looking at extroversion, but I'm not looking at any of the other big five. And if that's the case, you should probably delete those and say, maybe I'm looking at self-esteem and spirituality and religiosity. So I'm going to remove altruism and social, personal, emotional intelligence. So now these are the three variables in my particular study. I have hypotheses about these relationships. So these are the only three I'm going to keep and work with going forward. Now again, that may be different for you. You might be using different ones, but just pick out the ones that you are using and keep those, and you can remove everything else. All right, this basically now gets us to a point where we are done working in Excel. So it would be a good point to probably save your work. Make sure you save this Excel sheet. And now what we're going to do is we're going to move over into SPSS, and we're going to set up all of this information into SPSS so that we can analyze this, and we'll talk about some different things along the way. All right, so this next step is we are going to look at SPSS, and we are going to first talk about setting up our variables, entering in the data, and then actually running our correlation here. So let's go ahead and we're going to switch over to SPSS here and talk about where to go about starting this process. So in SPSS, as you can see, it's a little bit zoomed out, but hopefully you can see this okay. We'll talk about how to go about setting this up. Remember, SPSS gives us two views. We have our data view and we have our variable view. We're going to start off in our variable view, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to enter in our variables so that we can get those all set up and ready to copy the values in. So remember, in my example, I'm using the Big Five measure of extroversion, self-esteem, and spirituality and religiosity scales. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by, you can include participant number if you want to, though you don't have to in this case, but it may not be a bad thing to include just to kind of keep things straight and organized if you need to kind of switch back and forth or ever need to adjust values. So for good practice, I'm going to go ahead and include my participant number. Remember, SPSS doesn't like spaces or special characters in the variable names, so make sure you keep that in mind when you're creating your variable names here. So we have participant number, then we should have age, gender, and then we have the whatever variables you are using. You should have three, and again, for my example, I'm using the Big Five measure of extroversion. Then I have my self-esteem, and then I have my, we'll just call this religiosity to keep things simple. Oops. And what you're going to want to do is think about which variables might need to be adjusted. And at the end of the day, the only variable that really needs extra information added in here is going to be your gender variable. And that's because gender is going to be a nominal variable where everything else is basically going to be a scale variable, right? So because gender is nominal, we need to go ahead and make sure the values that we have are coded in for whatever the choices that we've been given were. We can look back at our Qualtrics survey and we can identify that anybody who had a value of 1 was a male selection, 2 was female, and 3 was non-binary or third gender. And if they did a 4, they prefer not to say. So look through your data. It might be a good idea to just code all of these in, though you may only need to code one or you might only need to code 2 or maybe 3 of them, depending on what options people selected. So I'm going to go here, and under my gender variable, I'm going to go to the values column. And from here, I want to select this cell and click the 3 dots on the right. I'm going to add in a new rule and say a value of 1 represents the label male. I'm going to add another rule, say a value of 2 represents the label of female. And then in this example set, we go up to 3, though you may or may not in the real data set. I'm going to go ahead and select 3 and say that this value is equal to, what did we say it was? It was non-binary. And then again, it might not be a bad idea to just put in 4, and that is prefer not to say. And that way you have all of them in, and you don't have to worry about missing one if you didn't catch it in the actual data. So with that set in there, I'm going to do one more thing, and that's just to remove my decimal places, just bring those down to 0, because I know I'm not working with decimals in any of my data. And with that all coded in and set correctly, I can switch back to my data view and take a look at my variables and see that they've been entered in correctly. And I have the same variables now that I have in my Excel sheet ready to go here in SPSS. And so now all I have to do is go back to my Excel sheet, copy the data that I have. Make sure when you copy it, you are not selecting the variable names, just the data itself, just the numbers. And with that copied, I can come over to SPSS, single select, so I have that gray highlighted box on the first cell, and then paste my data in. And hopefully it's going to paste and work. If it doesn't, remember there's a few different options we can do. We can go edit, we can look for our paste option here, and it looks like that worked for me. If that doesn't work, you can try right click, paste. And if all 3 of those are not giving you an option, it's grayed out and not letting you do it, what you can do is come up to the top of the screen here, click on this little circle, and go over to the open clipboard option, and you should be able to then paste in here and update, and then be able to paste your data. Hopefully though, one of the first options works, and that's the easiest way to go about doing this. So now notice that we have, I'm going to go ahead here and try and zoom in a little bit just so that we can see a little bit better. It is going to get rid of, I will have to scroll down to see the other views, but at least we can see the data and our options a little bit better here. So now what you should be seeing is all of your data entered in here. And you may notice that for gender, because we coded in those options, that you're seeing the text of those options. If you aren't seeing that, you're still seeing 1, 2s, and 3s or 4s or whatever numbers you have. You can switch back and forth using this value labels button as long as you entered in what those were in the previous step. And so I can toggle back and forth as many times as I want to either the numbers or the words. And remember, that's right up here, this value labels button. All right, with that set now in here, the next step that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and run our correlation. For correlations, we're going to go ahead and start with our Analyze tab here. Now, correlations are great because we have an option right on this first dropdown called Correlate. So it tells us pretty easily where we want to go to select this option. And so if I go to Correlate, what I'm looking for is just a simple bivariate correlation. So I want to choose this bivariate option, and that's the one I want. So if I click that, it's going to pop up a new window with all of my variables appearing on the left, and then the ones I want to include or run are going to go over on the right. Okay, Now, for correlations, we can use all of our scale variables. Normally, we don't want to look at gender in a correlation because it's a nominal variable. Now, if you only have choices for 1 and 2, you can look at gender preliminarily in a correlation just to get an idea of what's going on. But for good practice, we're going to go ahead and not look at gender, especially because we have 3 options, so we can't actually use this in a correlation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to include my age variable, and then the 3 variables that I've chosen for my particular study as well. With all of those variables entered in, we're going to go to Options and make sure we check the box to include means and standard deviations. Exclude pairwise is fine. We can leave that as it is and just hit Continue. Everything else should be set by default, but make sure you have Pearson's correlation, two-tailed, and flag significance checked off here. With that all set in, we can hit OK. That's going to run our correlation, pop up our output window, which remember now we have 2 windows, our data set, which still has 2 views, the data and variable view, and our output window, which gives us our results. What we should be seeing is 2 tables, our descriptive statistics, telling us the mean standard deviation of each of those variables, and then our correlation table, which is really the meat of what we're looking at here. Remember how to interpret a correlation table. We'll go over that real quickly. When you want to look at a relationship or a correlation between 2 variables, for example, let's just open this up here so that I can kind of talk about this a little bit better. When looking at our 2 variables, let's say we want to look at the relationship between our measure of extroversion and our measure of self-esteem. We look to see where they interact or intersect in the table, and this is the information about that particular correlation between extroversion and self-esteem. We can see the Pearson correlation value, 0.715, and our significance, which is our p-value, appearing right here. Remember, correlation value is your R value, significance is your p-value. N is just how many participants you had. The correlation value here is going to range anywhere from -1 to +1, and the stronger or the closer it is to either -1 or +1, the stronger that correlation is. So 0.715 is a pretty strong correlation, and it's also positive. So you know the direction based on whether it's positive or negative. Then we look at our significance to tell us whether or not that's a significant correlation. As long as this is below 0.05, we would say that it is. And this is well below 0.05. It's actually even below 0.01. So it's a highly significant correlation in this case. So when you look at your results assignment, you'll see examples on how to go about writing up and including this information. Just remember that your correlation is your R value, your significance is your P value, and then to get your degrees of freedom, which is another thing you'll need to know, it's what goes in the parentheses, you're going to take your N value and subtract 2. So my degrees of freedom in this case would be 13 minus 2, or 11. So that's what you need to know to write up your results and follow along on that assignment. And you can look at this for each of your predictions. So if I have my 3 variables, I would look at each of the relationships between the 3 of them. Big 5, self-esteem. Self-esteem, religiosity. And then religiosity and big 5 would be here. So we can look at each of those correlations between our 3 variables. Also, it's here, right? So the 3 we have there. If you would like to also look at age and see how that relates to your 3 variables, you can certainly do that as well. That's something else to talk about. All right, to look at gender, if you want to look at gender, the best way to look at that is most likely going to be with a t-test. However, if you have a good distribution, a good representative sample, you can look at this using an ANOVA. The way to find that out is we need to identify if we have a good representative sample of all of the gender choices. Now, often what ends up happening is we get a lot of representation for males and females, but not a lot for other gender options. So if that's the case, let's just quickly check this. If we go to Analyze, we want to go to Descriptive Statistics, and we'll go to Frequencies and do just gender here for frequencies. And that's going to tell us how many choices, let me just scroll down here, how many choices we had for each of the options. And you see we have 5 male, 6 female, and 2 non-binary choices. Now with your data set, you're going to have a lot more participants and probably a lot smaller percentage of anyone who does not identify as male or female. That's just what tends to happen in our data. If that's the case and that's what you see, then what you want to do is run a t-test. If you see a good even distribution of all three, then you can look at this using an ANOVA, but I'm going to assume that that's not the case. And if it is, we can certainly talk about that. But I'm going to assume we're going to be using a t-test to look at this. So to do that, you want to go to Analyze, and we're going to go to Compare Means and Proportions. And then we're going to look for Independent Samples t-test. From there, our grouping variable is going to be our gender variable. And we just want to define those groups as those values that we have for our gender options. Most likely, again, it's going to be 1 and 2 for male and female, and we're going to continue there. And then any variables you want to see, whether they're related to gender, you would include in this test variable option. And with those variables entered in, we can hit OK, and that gives us our t-test down here. Remember, we've talked about this with our SPSS sort of examples as we've went. When you're looking at this, you want to make sure that you look under the t-test section, so the t-test section here, and you want to look for your significance value. Now, I don't have any significance, so there wasn't anything related to gender here for my particular example here, though remember this is not real data, so you may very well see something for yours here. All right, so again, your write-up or your assignment will talk about how to go about writing up a t-test if you want to talk about that for gender and if you had any differences in your variables based on gender. All right, the last thing I want to quickly go over here in SPSS is how you would go about making a graph so that you can include that in your results section of your paper. So for graphs, remember we're going to go to graphs up here. And the easiest way to do this is we're going to scroll down and look for scatter/dot. Now I'm working in SPSS version 29. If you're in one of the older ones, you might have to go to an option called Legacy Dialogues, which will appear down here towards the bottom, and then you'll see all these options. But for me, I'm just, I can see these here. So I'm just going to go scatter/dot, and that's the one you're looking for. And then you can choose simple scatter is fine. And then what you want to do is select the two variables you're interested in looking at and put them in the X and Y axis here for your graph. Now, the example we just talked about here was the relationship between, what were we looking at? We were looking at the relationship between, it was my correlations here. We were looking at the relationship between the Big 5 extroversion and self-esteem, which was significant in our example. So I'm going to take those two, and it doesn't really matter which one goes where, but I'm going to put the Big 5 extroversion on the x-axis and then self-esteem on the y-axis. And again, it doesn't matter which one goes where because there's no direct, there's no cause and effect of correlations. It's just relationships, so they can be in any order. So with those put there, I'm going to hit OK, and that is going to create my graph down here in my output window. So if I scroll down, you can see I get my graph appearing. This isn't the best graph, especially because of the low number of data points I have, but you can generally get a sense that higher versions of extroversion were associated with higher versions of self-esteem. Now your graph may look nice like this, or even better than this, hopefully, but it may not. But this is how you go about creating a graph. And when you put this into your paper, the main thing that you want to do is sort of, screenshot or copy it in, but make sure that you're, making it look professional when doing so and following APA format. All right, with that, that should basically walk you through how to go about doing your results from start to finish. Remember that first part of this, this video was just me explaining how Qualtrics works. It was really once we started in Excel, that on was what you should be doing with the Excel file of the full data set that I provided to you in this assignment. So make sure you follow it along with that. For this particular assignment, for the lab report, what you should do is you should be submitting screenshots of your output with your results from the full data set that you've looked at. The main things I'm curious to see is your correlation table and at least one graph that you've chosen to create. So submit screenshots of those for this assignment for your lab report. And then when you're doing your results section for your paper, make sure that you follow that assignment and write this up as it should be in a paper following those instructions. Of course, if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out. I hope this was helpful. Again, pause, rewind, go back if you need to. And again, let me know if you have any questions. All right, thank you all. Good luck.